This trombone is very cool, historic, plays fairly well, and is fun to play, but is in the midst of an identity crisis. Let's talk about it. How's it going, y'all? It's Sam here from the Samuel Plays Brass channel. I hope you're all doing well on this fine day, and I appreciate you tuning in. We've got a very special guest today hailing to us from Elkhart, Indiana, the instrument I affectionately refer to as the Diet Bass Trombone, or better known as the CG Conn Model 72H. The Model 72H was in production from 1955 to 1968, and this one is from approximately 1957, according to the Conn Loyalist website. It was designed with Conn's number 5 or 0.562-inch bore, pretty standard for bass trombones. It's reported also to be 0.594 inches at the valve section specifically, and it's got a 9.5-inch bell flare. Again, fairly standard, although some players might prefer something a little bit larger. An interesting feature about the 72 is that it's also got a slightly longer hand slide than a conventional trombone, and much like this 88H, my prized possession, it's got a spring in the cork barrel. Notice how when I push the slide in, it springs back up. So there's a spring in there. So you have your first position and you have your sharpened first position. Very useful for notes that are flat, such as the D above the staff. And because of this, the bell section is actually a little bit shorter, so if you line a 72 up with this 88H at the bell, you'll notice the 72 is actually a little bit shorter in terms of length around the backside because of that longer slide. This 72H also features a standard closed wrap F attachment with a lot of pull to it. You could pull it all the way out to low E by stopping where the marking is on the slide, or you could pull it out even farther. It is low E plus change. And one thing to note was that this trombone was considered by Conn to be extra large for its time. We'll get to that later. While I would say the 72H plays fairly well as a whole, it does have a lot of oddball characteristics that really make it have a strange playing experience. First of all, the horn likes to play fairly flat on the pitch, especially if you use a full-size bass trombone mouthpiece, and this is true for both the main tuning slide and the trigger tuning slide. It's kind of hard to lip certain pitches up. They don't necessarily need a ton of lip up in, a decent room temperature space, but if you're playing, outdoors in the winter, you might be in a little bit of trouble unless you're using a fairly small or shallow mouthpiece. The spring in the cork barrel becomes especially necessary for one note in particular, and that's low trigger F. This actually was the trombone that made me start checking trigger F aggressively on every single trigger trombone I pick up. Some F attachment trombones have a really great low F in first position with the trigger, and some really do not. Unfortunately, on the 72H, if you tune your first position to where the spring is not taut as you're intended to do, when you press for that trigger low F, you have to bring the slide in absolutely as far as it will go to get it in tune. And in general, I noticed the trigger positions were a little bit weird. Low E and E flat felt closer to me than I expected them to be, and I've only noticed that on 2 trombones ever, both Conns, this one and my Conn 50H that's back there on the stand. All other trombones, including my 88H, also made by the Conn company, seem to have low E fairly close to the bell and low E flat a fair amount further from the bell. I would say the 72 responds best to mouthpieces that are on the smaller end of the bass spectrum, such as the Bach 2G that was in the case. That one felt like a fairly well-rounded choice. But in general, the response and blow and feel of the 72 are a little bit different from that of a modern bass like a Bach 50B or Conn's 112H. And in a few ways, this trombone felt somewhere in between a extra large tenor and an extra small bass. Now, most modern bass trombones use a dual trigger system with two valves operated by the left hand, and each of those has a fairly long and hefty slide that it redirects air through, and these slides extend towards the back of the instrument, overall adding a fairly significant amount of mass to the total bass trombone package, in addition to things like the larger bell. Now, the fact that the 72H only has one valve and one trigger attachment as opposed to two has as many, and I would argue as significant of, acoustical consequences as physical ones. It's not just that the 72 feels lighter in the hands because of the single trigger system. I think it actually has a lighter and daintier tone quality than most modern basses, and this is at times desirable and at times less than desirable. One decent use of the 72 is in earlier and lighter sounding classical works. Big beefy bass trombones weren't around at the time, and in fact they were sometimes using things like sackbuts, which have a much thinner tone quality. Brian Hecht of the Dallas Symphony Orchestra, and an international soloist for what it's worth, actually uses a single trigger bass trombone for certain earlier classical works. In my opinion, the best use of the 72 would be in a jazz band, especially on older charts. I think it has a really great sound with a decent amount of bite for that situation. And in general, wherever outside of jazz that you encounter third tenor parts, four-part wind ensemble sections, and occasionally in the symphony orchestra, such as Mahler's Second Symphony with the big brass chorale, I think there the 72H could really shine, even though it's technically classed as a bass trombone. I think it really bridges that gap nicely. And there are times where a darker or deeper sound is desired from a tenor trombone, such as the second tenor trombone solo from Rimsky-Korsakov's Russian Easter Overture. This is going to ruffle some feathers, but I do believe that the modern bass trombone sound concept and playability have sort of pushed past the Conn 72H and the single valve bass trombone in general, and sort of rendered it obsolete. And that feels weird to say because the 50s and 60s were not that long ago in terms of brass history, and it feels weird to say that an instrument from that time period would be obsolete. There are people who really affectionately cling to their 72s and even modify them to try and make them better suited for the modern orchestra. I've seen 72Hs with an extra trigger paddle that actually springs the trigger slide out all the way to a low E, so that at the end of the slide you can play a low B on demand more readily than having to reach behind you and pull that trigger out. And of course, there are people who have their reasons and can make it work in these settings much better than I can. But in my opinion, as a fairly mediocre bass trombonist, as a general consensus for bass trombonists, I think a dual valve system is much more practical and has sort of the right sound and playing characteristics for these modern settings. I consider the 72H to be a little bit of a novelty, but really great for early classical and jazz band style bass. And moreover, I find it to be pretty passable as an extra large tenor, especially with a slightly smaller mouthpiece like the 5GS that I was using in the Russian Easter Overture clip. Honestly, I think it maintains a really lovely, deep and dark sound with those smaller mouthpieces without necessarily sounding tubby as some basses might in that situation. And as one last thing, I think it's useful for especially young or especially old bass trombonists who want a little bit less mass on their instrument. Admittedly, not every bass trombonist needs to constantly play low C's and B's, and so that single trigger system is not going to be the end of the world for everybody. I hope you enjoyed this little piece on the Conn 72H. I definitely enjoyed my time with it between the summer of 21 and summer of 22, at which point I gave it back. I actually originally borrowed it to use as an extra large tenor because I didn't have an F attachment tenor at that point, and because it belonged to a friend of mine who I knew would trust me with that instrument. By the way, if you want to hear that friend and me play a duet on this bass trombone and their real bass trombone, you can find it up in the card. But anyway, as for now, that'll be all from me. This has been Sam of Samuel Plays Brass, reviewing the Conn 72H from Elkhart, Indiana. Until next time, we'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.